Hey everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Indie Game Movement, the podcast that talks about the marketing and business of indie games. I'm Andrew Pappas, one of your hosts today, and before we get into the episode, just want to say we're sorry. We had a little bit of a hiatus there. It's been summertime, we've been busy, but with that said, we're getting right back into it with episode 114, which is, when should indie devs create a company? Now, it's a big question we all face at one point or another. When does an indie dev get to the point where they should seriously consider taking it to the next step and form their own company? Now, starting any kind of side venture, it may be a big deal, but it doesn't mean you shouldn't take things seriously. At the very least, having some idea on what you want to do is super important. So in this episode, Mustapha and I are going to share our own personal experiences, share experiences of people that we have worked with before in terms of forming our own companies, what the procedure was like for us, and what we learned from it so you guys don't have to sweat the small stuff when deciding if forming a company is right for you. So that's what we're going to be talking about right here today on Indie Game Movement. Hey everyone, and hey Mustapha, how's it going? I know I mentioned real quick in the intro that we've been out a little hiatus and everything because we've just been busy, summer type stuff. So with that said, how has your summer been? What have you been up to?
Oh man, my summer has been absolutely awesome. I mean, a lot of school on my end. I'm doing the grad school thing full time, so that's taking up a lot of time. I did get to take a crack at Fire Emblem Three Houses.
Nice.
And
how was
yes,
that?
I have very much been having a good time with that game.
That's awesome. So then on my end, just been busy all around. Had some vacation time, not too much, but just enough to just spend some time with the family, which is great. And, man, what have I been playing for games? I feel like I never have time anymore to play games. There's something that popped up. Oh, there was one day I gave myself, and yeah, it's a little bit behind, but playing Dragon Quest XI.
Okay.
I got that on sale. I don't know why I bothered. I mean, I love the Dragon Quest series and everything, but if I remember correctly, it's like over 180 hours worth of gameplay, and we're talking to a person who willingly admits that they have no time whatsoever. So I don't know when I'm going to get around to even tapping anywhere near that 180 hours. But the fact that at one of those days of that vacation, I was able to plug away at I don't know, an extensive amount of time without any interruptions from family or anything. It was great. So, that wasn't the highlight, but it is one of the highlights. But still, the summer's been good. It's been busy, but that's in a nutshell for me as well. Just getting some Dragon Quest in there is great. Oh, and I finally got Rocket League. Yes, I know Rocket League. It's been around forever. I try to sparingly pick up games that I think that between me and my son. He's pretty young, so I'm looking for games that we can play together with that are fairly easygoing for him, but still enjoyable for me. And Rocket League was one of them. I think it was one of them on the summer sale. Picked that up and had some fun Rocket League playing as well. And that's it from the games front. So nice. You got some Fire Emblem in. I got some Dragon Quest and Rocket League, and it all sounds good. So. And hopefully everybody else has been having a good summer too, if you're in the U.S. If you're not, I'm sure you're enjoying your season as well, whether it's the summertime or quite the opposite. But either way, we hope everybody's having a good time. All right, so with that out of the way, we're just going to get right into the discussion here, which we provided some quick insight to, which is, when should indie devs create a company? Now, this is something, Mustapha, that's been kind of more, not necessarily top of mind for me or us, It's only that it's seemingly like I've seen a lot of this before, and I think like this type of question in general comes in waves. More recently, though, I've seen a few Reddit posts along this topic. I've even like chimed in to give my thoughts and how things went for me. But I mean, obviously, it's going to be an important question that everybody's going to enter at one point or have at one point or another. So I thought it was just naturally it was a good discussion for us to have on the show. So
Yeah, agreed. I mean, I think if we're going to talk about the marketing of indie games, if indie games are the center of what we do, then absolutely, I think the question of where does one start is always the scariest. It's the most daunting part of the whole thing, is figuring out, what your kind of launch off point is going to be.
yeah, exactly, because it's like everybody enters things at different stages, and their mindset is kind of in a different place and stuff. And it's like, hey, when should you start, or when should you form a company? So a couple things that we're just gonna get right into is like, the big question is, should I form one, right? So for some people, it's going to be pretty obvious, and others are like, I don't know. It could be more of a hassle than what I want to deal with, and that type of stuff. So I kind of have like a little bit, a couple set of rules, and feel free to like chime in or comment on whatever. But in general, I'm gonna always kind of lean over towards yes, if you're really serious about creating a game and everything, and you want to making this game and the development of the game more than just a hobby, right? And then also, if you're working with a group of people and you all kind of have that same vibe where like, hey, this is going to be more than a hobby. So yeah, we should probably make a company. And then obviously some people have talked about, hey, there's protection associated with that, detaches you from your personal assets. So that's like the main area in terms of, like, I would say the main criteria to consider, like, if you should form a company, those types of things. But Mustafa, from your perspective, what do you think would be good in terms of, like, if, let's say, forming a company might not be what you want to do, and what would constitute that thinking, and whether or not you should or shouldn't form? What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think you hit the nail on the head. For me personally, and I've kind of seen this from a couple of different angles because I've worked with a few teams before, not in a particularly heavy capacity, but regardless, anytime it's more than just you and you're working on something, I believe you should have something protecting you. I think an operating agreement is a great example of that. And so I would say if you've got any sort of partnership going on, becoming a legitimate business protects you. I'm sure anybody who's been to school can think back on the questionable nature of group projects and people not contributing, and kind of the challenge associated with like holding someone accountable under those circumstances. It's all fine and well when there's a grade on the line. I think the stakes become a lot higher when you're investing your own personal assets and buying things and requisitioning space and making use of resources local to you and things like that. So if any of that is true of the project you're working on, it's best to try and legitimize that as much as possible. Like you said about like assets and things like that, even just like the simple notion of keeping track of your expenses under one kind of unified corporate entity. Should you reach a point where you start to turn a profit, it makes it a lot easier to keep track of those sorts of things for tax purposes and what have you.
Yeah, and you did a really good job at like kind of summing all that. And what I'm going to do is kind of break some of that stuff down. So let's say for the person who's thinking, hey, this is kind of a daunting task. I don't know if I want to be tackled. I don't know if I'm going to really make this into a career. It's more of a hobby type thing for me. I would say at that point, it's probably okay. I'm just going to say okay to not necessarily form a company. But with that said, there's other things too to keep in mind with that. Well, one, I mean, in terms of like, you're creating something. Like, the one thing people talk about a lot too is like, hey, that's gonna, if you form a company, it's gonna give you protection. And then a lot of people's retort is simply, oh, well, protection from what? From being sued and going after my own assets and stuff, my personal assets like your house and things like that. Well, that doesn't really mean anything. Like, no, really, who's gonna sue me for my simple platformer mobile game? You're right. But what people don't necessarily understand, it's not necessarily the fact that someone could sue you, but it does give you another level of protection. So let's say you're putting a lot of time, energy, and money into something, and you take out a few credit cards or loans or something like that. From my perspective, I would rather have you like bootstrap than go about that route. But let's say you do that and things don't go well. Well, at the end of the day, if you're not paying your loans back and everything, banks could still come after you and sue you. And if you don't have any separate entity associated with those particular costs and stuff, then that gives them one reason to go after you. And I think that's something that a lot of people don't necessarily think of, probably because it might not be a typical scenario that devs are faced with. But let's face it, we've all heard those stories where people are like, oh yeah, I took out all these credit cards and maxed them out and everything. And not that we encourage that behavior or anything, but sometimes, that's, hey, you make the choice, you decide to do it and you do it. And if that happens and, hey, if it, for whatever reason, doesn't work out, at least having a company is going to be or having a company or an entity formed that's separate from your own personal assets and just you personally is going to be beneficial in that respect. And before we go even further, we're just to fully come out there, we're not accountants, we're not lawyers. We're just simply two guys that have both independently formed our own companies and just have some insight that we wanted to share with the rest of you guys because we know how important this is.
Yeah, and then I've also, I've worked in game development scenarios where, we as a group tried to perhaps commercialize projects without having been a formal business or a legitimate business as well. And so I can speak to it from that angle too, which isn't to say anything about the team I worked with. All of them were great, honestly. But there were just very small things, even as far as development practices, that were a lot harder to keep track of when we didn't have the sort of documentation to support us.
Let's dive into that a little bit further because that's a really good point. And something I think a lot of people tend to forget about is essentially an operating agreement. So why don't you provide a little bit more insight in terms of what an you alluded to it earlier, but what exactly is an operating agreement and why is it important?
Right. Yeah. So, for those who don't know, an operating agreement is essentially an official contract sort of document that you would draft up with co-founders, assuming you're all in equal shares of the company. And that would determine basically how your sort of day-to-day functions. It sets parameters for project work, expectations for attendance with meetings, the process for, say, investing your own money into the company, putting money in a corporate account, dealing with finances in general, any sort of expenses that would be needed. This would tell you kind of the step-by-step as to how to go about that. And in an ideal world, I think in a lot of states it's required. That's something that the state would have on file. Just for the sake of if for some reason you and your partners were to come into some sort of legal dispute, this documentation is on file. It's got all of your signatures on it, and as a result of that, you're able to reference it to defend yourself if needed. Should there be challenges with the upkeep of equal shares of the work or something goes wrong with your finances, things like that.
Yeah, and I mean, Mustapha provided a lot of good ideas in terms of the legal sense, but just from even like an emotional one too. I mean, when you go into an agreement with a bunch of people that you're working with, it's super helpful. It excuse me, it helps alleviate a lot of stress
Hmm.
to know exactly everything's defined. You have a meeting, and you set everything in place, and everybody is on the same page. And that's where it's
Yeah.
extremely beneficial because at any point, like if you're on the same page and you all shake hands on it, and it's not outside of just it being a legally binding document. If something happens up, you could be like, hey, dude. Hey, I know that you might not necessarily be focused in this realm, and I get things happen and stuff, but regardless of